Hi, this is the Untangling Self podcast, and I'm here with Vincent today. I've been following you for quite some years now, and I'm going to start with talking about why I felt called to record this conversation with you, Vince. I value your presence on my timeline. You bring something rare and different to the timeline, um, some elder energy, and also bridging Buddhist practice, meditation, awakening to an actual willingness to show up in the mess of this world.
Mm,
And we have not interacted before this, but you are the only person I somewhat know who has a direct connection to the land of Palestine.
mm,
And what's happening in Palestine is something that has brought up a bunch of feels for me over the last couple of years. It directly tests some of the things that I claim to care about: nonviolence, compassion, showing up with more care in the world. And I wanted to talk with someone for whom this is not just theoretical. Um, I don't want to go into the politics of what's happening. I feel there's an undeniable genocide happening, and it's horrifying and heartbreaking. And I want to explore the various ways in which I and others can relate to what's happening. And but before we go meta, before we bring spirituality or self-exploration into this, yeah, I'd love to talk about your connection to Palestine. I imagine the last 2 years have not been easy for you. I can imagine there's been a lot of pain and challenging times for you.
mm,
And I also feel that one of the things that inhibits care is abstraction. And yeah, I want to drop some of that and listen to your story and anything that you'd like to share, anything about how you have found yourself relating to it in different
mhm,
phases. What has grief been like for you, and what are some alive challenges for you in this area?
mm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to do that. Let's thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you, and it's cool to record it so that people can kind of glean what they do from it. I guess I'll share a bit of my story in terms of my connection to Palestine. But I will say, yeah, it's hard to avoid the politics entirely because even when you frame it as a genocide, it's already political at
Yeah.
that point. But uh, that said, I mean, my relationship to this has never really been primarily political. It only became that in recent years. I grew up in a family in Western North Carolina. I grew up uh, mostly with my grandparents as kind of parent figures. My mom was quite young and she was struggling. So I ended up actually moving in, living with my grandparents when I was two. Later, my mom came and joined us, and we all kind of lived in the same area. So I kind of grew up with my grandmother Peggy and my grandfather Latif. And Latif is Palestinian. He grew up in Palestine. And then at 15, this is 1948, as the Arabs called it, the Nakba, the catastrophe. This is when he and his family were sort of uh, they were pushed off of their land by force and the threat of force, at gunpoint. And this wasn't the start of violence. He recalled a lot of earlier events with the British Empire and the British Army, which I'm sure this is something we can both relate to in terms of history, right? Um, because they had occupied Palestine prior to that and sort of set up the transfer, with with the Zionists in Europe who wanted to form a Jewish state. So, it's like the history of violence for him was like from the beginning. But this was like a pretty major event, and he had to flee his home and ultimately flee the country. He ended up coming to the United States, where he excelled in school and was able to set up a life here. So he was quite lucky, compared to a lot of the other folks who left Palestine. Um, and so basically he raised me, as a kind of father figure. I literally called him Pops, which is sort of English for father. And so even though I'm sort of a quarter Palestinian, genetically, my experience of being Arab, growing up in an Arab family with lots of Arab family members, hearing Arabic all the time, eating Arabic food, you know, um, having Muslim aunts and uncles. My experience of being Arab or Palestinian it feels much more salient than just like I'm a quarter Arab. I don't reduce it sort of to the biology. It feels like a much bigger part of me. And actually, it's become even more so in the last several years. There's quite a while where I can pass as being white in the US, and everything is racialized here as white and not white. So because I could pass that way, I often would, because it was sort of skillful tactic survival wise, and but part of the cost of passing turns out to be that you sort of have to dissociate yourself from some part of your identity. You have to pretend like that's not part of who you are. And if you pretend enough, then you start to believe that to some degree. So it's actually several years ago, during the pandemic, when George Floyd was murdered here in the United States. And there was a huge kind of racial kind of awakening slash reckoning that was happening here, that I really ended up diving back down into that Palestinian identity and started to do some reclamation work of kind of reclaiming that part of me and recognizing the cost of whiteness, or as one guy I spoke to on the Buddhist Geeks podcast called it, the tragedy of whiteness, where you kind of have to squash all these other aspects of your ethnic identity in order to fit into quote unquote white culture. So I did that work, and that brought me closer to that part of my identity, which in a way has been good news and bad news. Because the good news is I feel more whole and I feel more of who I am. I don't feel like I'm hiding as much. At that point, I took on my grandfather's last name, Fakhoury, and I added that into my formal name and started to kind of proudly announce who I was. And most people didn't really know that. They didn't know that about me. So it was very much like coming out, in a certain way. The bad news, of course, is like I came out at a really bad time. You could say,
Yeah.
just a couple of years before this genocide started, and this was obviously kicked off by Hamas and this sort of terrible attack that they orchestrated. But very quickly, and I knew within a week of it happening that it was going to be really bad. The backlash, and anyone who'd followed this topic before October 7th also knew that, because that was sort of the history of the tit for tat. There'd be
Yeah.
some kind of violence that would happen on Palestinians, would throw rocks or kill someone, and then there'd be a kind of 10x response in kind by Israel, where roughly 10 they would kill 10 times as many people slash civilians. And so that had usually happened at smaller scales. It'd been like hundreds of Palestinians killed, um, and tens of Israelis killed. But because of the scale of what happened with October 7th, I just had this really terrible foreboding feeling of like, this is just going to be like awful. And then they turned off the water, turned off the food, turned off everything to Gaza, which one of my friends in Israel called an open aired prison. And I was just like, oh, this seems like genocide. This is what you do if you want to conduct a genocidal campaign. And so from the very, like a week after October 7th, I just kind of knew that was the road we were heading down. But the weird thing, of course, like being here in America, is like that's not at all what anyone else was saying. especially in mainstream media sources. So it was like from my point of view, like everyone else was sort of had this other narrative, this other story about what was happening. And it reminded me of September 11th, very much. I was 19 on September 11th, 2021. And I remember, the way that our country went into war, even though it was obviously not with the right countries
Yeah.
and with bad intelligence. Even so, like everyone wanted revenge, and there was this immediate thing, the shock of being attacked, and then the sort of revenge seeking response. And so I knew from living through that as well, the psychology, the sort of mass psychology of what can happen, especially when a privileged group of people who aren't used to violence being at their doorstep experience it. Suddenly the response can be massive. And
Yeah.
so yeah, just seeing and knowing both of those things, it was just like a perfect storm of a hellish storm. And it has been that way for me personally, the last 2 years. I remind myself daily, like, I'm not there, I'm not experiencing this violence. This is all sort of psychic and emotional. It's about my connection to people that I care about. I have a cousin named Rania and her family who live in the West Bank, who I have personally met and know them. And I have, of course, a lot of family members, Palestinian family members who live here in the United States, nearby, many of whom left during the Gulf War from Kuwait, when they were kicked out of the country and came here as refugees. And they have a lot of connections there in the area as well. So it's kind of those connections that has me be feeling so much around what's happening there. And I have to acknowledge that, like, I do think it's understandable that people who don't have these direct relationships and connections, to Palestine, don't feel it as distinctly, and that's sort of natural. It's like kind of natural to care more about the people in your like family or ethnic group. And I think in often in like, at least in American Buddhism, I don't know how it is in the Buddhist scenes that you roll in. I think you partially roll in similar scenes as me that are more global and internet
Yeah.
connected, but I don't know how it is in India. But like we have this ideal that like if you're really enlightened or awakened, that you somehow are like the Buddha and you just care about all sentient beings equally, and you've washed away every trace of ethnocentrism and egocentrism. And that's just not how I look at things. I don't view the world that way, and I don't experience it that way. I think it's natural to care about the people you're more identified with. And of course, if we just stop there, it's terrible. But yeah, I've been feeling a lot of personal pain and depression, anxiety, hopelessness, anger, all of the like the full gambit. And it's like every day I wake up and I'm usually somewhere between like 3 and 4 on the anxiety scale, 0 to 5. It's
Mhm.
like borderline, sometimes panic attack, but not quite. Always some anxiety in my chest. And I just know it's connected to that. I know it's related to just sensing and feeling what's happening for these people that I really care about and identify with.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel you.
Hope that's not too abstract.
Now, yeah. And yeah, given that you undertook this project of reclaiming your identity a few years ago before this happened, dissolving whatever dissociation was there, and in some sense making yourself more vulnerable, more tender
Yeah.
to something like this.
Right.
And I imagine unconsciously something that was keeping the dissociation was in place was the fear of something like this happening, the fear of perhaps opening yourself up to this much intensity of
Mm-hmm.
pain.
Yeah. Fear of persecution as well. Like, you
Right.
know, yeah, it's like if you're out and open, you can be persecuted more easily.
Yeah. Yeah. And and now that that's happening, and yeah, this is where I would also love to weave in your yeah your Buddhist practice, your the intimacy with fear that you have perhaps developed through years of practice, and in general, the practice of embracing intensity and opening your heart up to these emotions. Yeah, I'd love to hear about what it has been like for you transmuting some of these emotions, the anxiety, the anger, the grief.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when I first got into Buddhism, like most people, I was trying to transcend all of these things, not to transmute or include them. So, that was the first, half of the arc of my journey with Buddhism was really about trying to transcend my suffering, and not even really understanding the causes and root causes of it. A lot of which I think does root back to the sort of multi generational trauma on my grandfather's side. But since I've taken the turn toward including all of these things, which in the Buddhist frame would be like more like second, third turning um, movement, turnings being the sort of epochs of Buddhist evolution in which, new ideas about what awakening is emerged. And really there's a turn toward a more non-dual understanding of what enlightenment is, that it's not nirvana is not separate from samsara, rather they're one and the same, as Nagarjuna put it. So since that time, where I feel like that's been the arc of my practice, waking down instead of waking up,
Mhm.
I've been trying to learn how to do that first with like basic things like being in relationship, making a living, while also caring about contemplation, trying to have values in a world that seems like it doesn't really give a shit about values, largely. Um, and so, like baby steps, I'd say I started kind of along that waking down path maybe 15 years ago or so. And so I had fortunately learned a number of things. I'd become a parent. I'm a father of a 10-year-old now. And so, yeah, I have a number of tools around how to work with this stuff. A lot of them are like psychodynamic tools using, different psychotherapeutic approaches. Um, some of it's just being willing to be vulnerable and intimate about my human experience instead of trying to present myself as someone who's beyond it all, which is what I try to do on X, and with mixed results. Sometimes people don't like to see a spiritual teacher who has opinions and is loud and angry. But I don't give a shit about that, because that's not what this is about. And if that's the idea they have, then I'm not going to be useful to them probably anyway. So yeah, so it's kind of hard though. It's kind of hard to transmute stuff when there's just no end. Like I was watching Geber Mate, who's a Jewish psychotherapist. He actually was a baby during the Jewish Holocaust. Um, and so like has direct experience with this stuff. It's not theoretical for him at all. And I remember him talking about his time visiting Palestine and speaking to fellow psychotherapists there. And he said, one of the things that they observed is that there is no PTSD when the trauma is never post, when there's never an end to it. How can you actually heal from it? And I feel like there's some way in which that applies in this circumstance, where it's like I don't. There's some part of the things I don't know how to transmute or heal this thing that doesn't end. Because the moment I feel like I've gotten some perspective on it, or I've had some catharsis and I've released some amount of pain and have some insight, it's like there's another wave, and they just keep coming. So I guess that's kind of it. Is like just learning how to be in the water and constantly being hit by wave after wave after wave, unrelentingly. And it's like, okay, how do you deal with that? Well, you just keep kicking and you keep trying to stay above water. Sometimes I go under, and I find it a little hard to function. I've struggled more during this period than in the past with things like substance abuse, with taking care of myself, with health. And so a lot of it's been trying to figure out how to just stay present with what's happening and not disappear. That's been a lot of the work, which brings me back to my first turning training, the early Buddhist training of renunciation and discipline. So that's actually coming back online for me more. It's hard to stay in the non-dual space where everything is one when
Yeah.
you're one with just a shitty situation. And if you can do something about it, if I, which I feel like I can do a little bit, it's to stay, just try to stay healthy and stay present, so I can be of benefit, and I can actually show up for what's happening, and be able to transmute it somehow. But yeah, I don't know that I really know how to do that. Actually, it's
Yeah.
always testing my limits.
Yeah, I can imagine. And yeah, this thing that you talked about, yeah, how a lot of spiritual paths are renunciative uh,
Yeah.
in nature. And and if you're subscribing to that view, uh, what action you need to take is quite clear in some sense. It's
Right.
black and white in some sense. And but yeah, given that that feels incomplete, given that that feels something's missing, something's not quite right, especially when
Hmm.
there's something like this happening out in the world.
Right.
How do you conceive of action? How does action emerge? Where does it emerge from? Where does it,
Mm.
what, what's the role of action in your spiritual path?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, if you're renunciative, um, or renunciate, the actions are usually pretty clear. Like when something comes up that I'm trying to transcend, I figure out some way to let go of it or to turn away from it, so that I can protect myself and others from it. Um, Whereas, you were talking, you use the word transmutation, which is a term that's used more in these sort of more non-dual traditions, where the idea is actually, you can take difficult experiences like anger or grief and transmute them into something that's quite wise, um, if you know how, or if you're able to. And so there, I think the action is different, where it's like more an action of, instead of stepping away, it's more an action of stepping into. And I see those as the two basic moves. Like you can move away or you can move toward. And at this point, I don't think there's kind of always a right way to do that. There's times where it is skillful to step away or to turn off the news or to stop scrolling down the infinite timeline. um, and I found that helpful to kind of at times recognize when I'm overwhelmed and I'm triggered, and just like I need to step back so that I don't, just spew everywhere. At other times, it feels like, especially when I see and feel people just ignoring or avoiding reality, that like stepping into and even potentially embracing conflict, or standing strongly for a very clear polarized position, which I feel like is actually, morally good, that might challenge people or upset them, is actually the right thing to do. Um, and then other times I can at moments feel, great compassion for everyone, and I can zoom out to like 100,000 feet view, and I can see this is just multi-generational trauma, going from one culture to the next over long periods of time, riding these cycles of history, and this is always how it's been and always probably will be to some degree. And I can kind of feel a little bit of detachment and cosmic, wonder. That's rare, but it happens. So I don't know, I see all of those things as things that happen, and I try my best to develop my agency to be able to make these moves consciously, instead of just be kind of caught by the riptide of reality.
Yeah. A word I really like when thinking of action is eros.
Mm,
And there's something about what you said earlier, that naturally you will care more about certain things over other things. And given our unique history, composition, context, all of us are more predisposed in certain directions to care more about certain things over other things.
Right.
And given that your eros will naturally pull you to care more about what's happening in Palestine,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
do you have a sense of what arc your eros is going to take in the coming months, years? Like what feels like something that, yeah, feels like your divine responsibility in some sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's becoming clearer. Um, this conversation that we're having is connected to that for me. I put out a call recently that you responded to, which was like an invitation to speak to anyone who wanted, a, not just about Israel Palestine and what's happening there, but to include that, to not like ignore it or avoid it as part of the conversation. And so that's been part of it, is just for me speaking up and speaking out and speaking to this topic, and not seeing it as separate from the spiritual practices and Buddhist training and all of that stuff. The integral training, I also study with a integral philosopher named Ken Wilber, who really influenced my views about a lot of this stuff. So like I want to bring that into, like you said, the muck, into the world, and and see like how good are these ideas and practices really, like how useful are they.
Yeah,
And I've been a little disappointed with that, actually. I'll be honest with you. It's not
yeah,
entirely. There's some ways in which they're not that useful. They're used often, I think, to help people avoid dealing with the reality rather than giving people the tools to be able to deal with it better.
yeah, yeah. And this is where I would love to segue into how, like any individual, how, so naturally, like I said, some people would care more about what's happening, some people less.
Yes,
Thing
understandably.
happening where you can, whether you're looking away or you're looking at it, and you can look at it and then maybe choose to not do anything about it, which feels okay, understandable. There's something about wanting to look away, something about constricting our heart, or our hearts getting constricted, something,
Mm-hmm.
um, for a lot of people in different ways, given how complex life and the world is, something makes it unsafe to look at
Right.
what's happening. And how I see what you're doing and why I was also feel called to record this conversation was with you was that, oh, this is an invitation to look at what's happening, and you are inviting others to look at it, look at what's happening, nudging, inviting, even like, yeah, shouting at them to look at it in some moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if I have a explicit question here, but there's something about this looking away, not looking away dynamic, um, or something about like not having anyone that's inviting uh, people to look at it in ways that feel safe, and not confusing to look at it. Because given that it's a, for a lot of people, this is an internet phenomenon. It's happening thousands of miles away, and if not for internet and global media,
Yeah.
a lot of us would have probably have no idea that this was even happening.
Right.
And because internet and the global media, which is very distorted in a lot of ways, and there's so much distrust about what one can safely look at or not look at, what one can allow themselves to be moved by, this all like further like mixes things up.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you had to like, yeah, ramble in that direction of, yeah,
Yeah.
inviting people to look at it and in a way that feels safe and not confusing for them,
Yeah.
yeah, what would you say?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I would sort of slightly reframe what you're sharing about the safety part. I feel like to me it's more that people feel overwhelmed, which overwhelm is an uncomfortable emotion feeling. It's like there's too much. I can't make sense of it. And maybe then they conclude it's not safe, because it's overwhelming. But I think
Mm.
the overwhelm happens prior to that assessment. And sometimes, yeah, people may not make up that it's not safe to feel overwhelmed. They just may not have time to feel overwhelmed, or they, like because they're focused on other things. I guess one thing that comes to mind here is like it's like a model of human development. This is something I learned from Ken Wilber and his integral theory, where he studied a lot of different adult developmental theories, looking at like how do people change after they, go through the early childhood stages of development, which are pretty well known and acknowledged to be cross cultural and true. Jean Piaget was the theorist who kind of kicked off that study, but there's been a lot of other ones who picked up that kind of work and said, well, does it just stop when we become, teenage at 18 years old, do it 20, do we just stop developing? And it's like, well, no, you can look around and you can see two people who are in their 70s or 80s, and they can be very different maturity wise, right? It's like one can be seeming like they haven't matured much since they were 18, and the other could be like a vastly different and more wise person. So obviously some kind of development must account for that difference, and human development must continue or be able to continue. And so I think of like that model of, very simply, of like we all start by developing an ego. When little tiny babies haven't even gotten to that stage yet. They're just like one with their environment. They're like everything they're seeing and hearing, it's just like all part of them and their impulsive world. It's beautiful, but it's also like you wouldn't call that like super developed.
Yeah.
um and then they develop like a sense of self. I watch my son, his sense of self come online, and it's very interesting to see like people's preferences start to come online, and their need to be comfortable and safe and protected, and have the sensations that they want, or at least to have some pleasure, and all of those things. And then hopefully, we develop to the point where we don't just center our own needs and wants and desires. We also start to include other people's needs and wants, especially our close family, initially our parents, our siblings, our extended family, they're friends of the family. We start to see them as part of me. And that's famous developmental psychologist Robert Keegan would call that the socialized mind. Where you have this sense of having a mind that is not just limited to your own identity, but it's more ethnocentric. It's includes others, and you care about what others think. That's hugely important. Most religions are based on that kind of ethnocentric stage of moral development, where it's like, hey, you want to, you know, um, treat others as you want to be treated, and you want to, like, do things that you don't want done to yourself. Okay, that's beautiful. But it's limiting too, because a lot of those traditions also will exclude lots of categories of people from, and animals and stuff from, from that. It's like, oh, you don't want to hurt others if they're like you, but it's okay to kill those other people, or to have religious warfare with them or whatever. So there's like the emergence of a world centric stage of development, where you actually care about all people, and you care about them equally in some level. um and then maybe beyond that, you could say you start to care about the whole planet and all the inhabitants of our planet, become more planet centric. And then Ken would argue there's a cosmocentric stage of development, where you could actually identify with the entire manifest reality. um that seems pretty far off from where we are at the moment, so I'll keep that. It's like probably, but that's theoretical in some parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I imagine like up until 150 years ago or 200 years ago, the ideas of world centric or planet centric were, yeah, probably alien to a lot of people who had
Right.
not seen beyond like 50 or 100 kilometers of where they were living.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's in some sense why Buddhism to me was so radical. because here at the heart of Buddhism, you have a very cosmocentric
Yeah.
view of like all sentient beings throughout space and time, throughout the six realms. May all beings be free. And when the Buddha was asked after his enlightenment, what are you? Human? And he was like, no, I'm not a human. That speaks to a kind of identity that transcends even humanness, and it's more like I'm identified with consciousness or sentience, um, and all sentient beings, no matter their bodies and backgrounds and conditioning, I,
Mm.
generating this heart of unlimited, boundless love and compassion toward all beings. That's profound. I mean, that's amazing. I think that's a beautiful vision. Um, speaking to your term of the eros, it's like that's the eros of the Buddhist tradition.
Yeah.
But then, something I learned from Ken Wilber is that development is a process of transcending. Yes, you do let go of a previous stage of development, in that that's not your primary locus of identity, but it's also a process of including those previous stages. You never let them, they're never gone entirely. And we know this, right? It's like sometimes we act like babies, even as adults.
Yeah.
um, and that's because we regress, and we have these parts of us that are still egocentric, they're still ethnocentric, that are hopefully world centric as well. But that's, I guess, part of how I understand development is like we need to push into these broader, wider spaces of identity where we include more as part of who we are. At the same time, we have to include the previous stages, because part of often transcending is you kind of start to get, you demonize the earlier stage of development you're transcending for a while, and you demonize it not just in yourself but in everyone. This is why you have this phenomena like in American politics, right, of like you have these very world centric minded Democrats who are like all super angry about how ethnocentric the Republicans are, and yet they are displaying the same amount of tribalness, maybe even you could argue more tribalness than the other group. And I would argue, because I grew up in the South in the United States, where there's a lot of ethnocentrism, that a lot of conservative minded people, religious people, are actually have a healthier inclusion of their ethnocentrism. They're more integrated at that level, and that leads to often kinder and more directly like generous behavior. Whereas you can meet someone who you talk about how all people should be free everywhere and have democratic, institutions or whatever, and you can agree on that level, and then you watch them be a total asshole. They've disowned their parents, they're a jerk, and you're like, wait, what's going on here? How do you have these beautiful values and we can, totally connect on this level, but then you seem to be a jerk, you know? And I think that's partially explains why, and it makes is partially a way of understanding why it's natural for people when they look at a topic like this to feel overwhelmed and then to kind of regress to an ego or ethnocentric level. Maybe they haven't even accessed the world centric level that much, and it's hard for them to uh, even care about people that don't look like them or don't live near them. But I think for a lot of people, we do have that capacity. We're just too stressed to often be able to open to it. So I think one thing I want to do is just acknowledge, yeah, it is okay as a human being to not be able to always be world centric. And the answer to that is to work at the levels that we're at. Like if it's egocentric, we have to work at that level, and we have to figure out, how do I get my needs met? Uh, how do I take care of my family and the people around me that I care about? Once I can do that, then I have more space and energy to look at the world outside of my domain and to care about my impact on that world.
Yeah. And it seems all of that can happen simultaneously, just like there's regression, there's also, you know, whatever is the opposite of regression, like the moments where there's
Yeah.
some
Progression.
capacity opens up and
Yeah.
allows us to care for what was an hour ago difficult to care about or irrelevant to care about.
Right.
And, and yeah, yeah, I like the reframing on the safety bit. Um, yeah, another way of putting it would be that when you're looking at it, it's bringing up some feelings that you don't want to feel, and so you choose to look away. And
Yeah.
partially it is because of um, lack of skill or capacity to be with those feelings, to be present.
Yeah. You renounce them. It's the
Yeah.
renunciative path.
Yeah. Yeah. And even in the renunciative path, like you you just like end up staying present with those feelings without doing anything about it, like dissolving it into emptiness or
Right.
whatever.
Right. That would be a step a little more toward the experience to at least
Yeah.
allow it to be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if your goal is to let it terminate into the void. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Use it to purify yourself or whatever.
Yeah. 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 Fair
Yeah.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah. And but if you're speaking to someone that is okay, is willing to look at it and intermittently, unreliably has the capacity to
Mm-hmm.
be with
Mm-hmm.
what it is that it brings up looking at this,
Right.
some of which can be confusion, helplessness, guilt, uh,
Right. Right.
and also compassion, care, heartbreak. Um, yeah, what would you have to say to someone who, for whom like this territory is very new or unfamiliar in some way, and also not black and white in any way? It brings up, simultaneously brings up a bunch of feelings if they stay long enough with it,
Yeah.
which can be paralyzing for any action to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I've been noticing when I talk to people about this that I'm like connected to, like let's say in person, is that people often have a hard time. They feel like they can't relate, or they're having a hard time empathizing. When in reality, if they were to actually examine their own histories and their own ancestry, they could find areas where they can relate. Like I think everyone has some experience of being persecuted, either personally or historically, being on the margins, being marginalized, being oppressed, like actually having some kind of dominant force who is acting on you externally or on your ancestors. So I like, for instance, a friend of my son's, his father came over, and his father has this experience of having worked in summer camps. That was an Israeli Palestinian summer camp program, like bringing the two sides together. So he had new people and friends in both, from both backgrounds. So it wasn't completely theoretical to him.
Mhm.
And so he was, asking me about how I'm doing, which I appreciated. And then saying like, yeah, it's really hard for as someone who's Irish, it's really hard for me to relate to this. And I'm also partially Irish on my grandmother's side. And so I was like, well, not really though, because look at the Irish famine. This was again, going back to the Great Britain, this was largely enabled by Great Britain. 1/8 of the population of Ireland died during this time. Another eighth had immigrated, left the country to escape dying. And historians seem to agree that it was, the Britain played a huge role in this. It wasn't just a natural potato famine, although that was part of it. It was also had to do with capitalism and colonialism and global trade and all these things, and laissez-faire capitalism. So it's like, okay, if he were able to see that and understand his own history. I mean, America is based on this history as well. All the people that came here and colonized America and genocided the indigenous people here and brought slaves from Africa. Like, these people were escaping religious persecution, most of them in Europe. Protestants escaping, Catholic, religious persecution. Okay, so if we all have this in our history and we haven't looked at it and we don't see the connections, then that's, I think, the work that we have to do on a personal level, is to actually understand our own conditioning. And what, because it's the experience of persecution that's undigested that leads to people becoming persecutors or supporting persecution. Like, if you've actually digested that and the pain of it, and you feel it in your bones,
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to, and you see the heartbreak of it, and you forgive the persecutor, you know, and you see that they too were being driven by similar forces, that they're not separate from you, they're not evil in some fundamental sense. Like then that's what stops the process of continuation. um and I think that's the work, you know, in a lot of ways I see we most need to do now, is this sort of intergenerational um, healing, not just personal healing, which is primarily uses the frame of the individual as the basic starting point for reality. It was like, no, let's take our, you know, connectedness as the beginning point, interdependence as the starting point. You know, what does psychotherapy look like then? You know, it looks different than just
Yeah.
working on your stuff. yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. And it seems there's something here to reclaim for all of us, that if we can have the courage to open our heart up to what's happening and stay with what it brings up, that, yeah, it will bring up some stuff that we have not wanting to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how many people want to look at how they're, you know, like my wife, you know, she's done this work and I've watched her. She's from the South. She's white, and her family's been here for several generations, unlike my family who immigrated here fairly recently in American history. And so she's like, how many people want to look at like their family ancestry and like the part of their family that had like owned slaves and had like certificates of slaves up on the walls, you know, and that like she remembers seeing that as a child, you know, like they're still proudly displaying it, like the Confederate statues, you know. It's like how many people want to really, you know, address that or look at that in themselves, you know. That's or to feel that they're that they're in some ways conditioned by a continuation of that heritage. Like, you know, that's a really painful thing to look at, but I can say from seeing her work with it and seeing my own work with it, it's like, yeah, but it's so important. If you don't look at that, how are you ever going to do something different? You're just going to play out your conditioning, right? Your programming in a
And
new
which can be
way.
very subtle, and which can just happen inside your own head. How you're
Right.
relating to yourself, the ways in which you're
Yeah.
treating yourself, talking to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And it comes out in less subtle ways too, you know, like before I did this kind of reckoning with my own kind of being able to pass as white and whiteness. It's like before I literally looked at that and meditated on race directly, you know, I can see how defensive I would get about it. And I could see how I would dismiss a lot of things that now I think are totally real. Like
Yeah.
I would say, oh, microaggression, oh, that's bullshit. You know, and so now like, no, it's not bullshit. That's a real phenomena when people are kind of like just tuning you out or saying things that are subtly and hurtful without even recognizing unconsciously. When you're living in an environment where all you're feeling is that constantly, and over many years, like it wears on you and it stacks up, and it's a force of dehumanization. So it's like, okay, but I couldn't see that until I actually let go of being white, you know, as like my primary identity, and saw the painfulness of that, you know, and the sense of a dominance, at least in, you know, again in Western cultures, there's a sense of like we're better than everyone else. um you know, yeah, it's really difficult to do that because it requires owning the parts of you that aren't dominant, that are more subject to pain and hurt, and you have to be vulnerable, which is, oh my god, who
Yeah.
wants to be vulnerable? Some people, but rare.
Yeah. And yeah, like you talked about towards the beginning, this stuff is not part of the classical toolkit.
No,
Yeah,
it's not
no
really.
one was teaching how to meditate on race.
No.
And no one is doing that even now.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, there's maybe you could say something around the
yeah,
caste system in India, like, and
yeah,
I mean, the fact that the whole like monastic movement was breaking out of the traditional caste system, and is you I think you can draw some connections and linkages that help see the through line. But yeah, you're right that we didn't have that as part of the classical toolkits.
Yeah. And yeah, are there any practices or ways of seeing or ways of relating that have been particularly powerful and helpful for you on this path?
Mm.
Yeah, what would you recommend to someone that feels like, oh, there's
Mm.
something here, definitely something here, and something I could look at if someone could give me some point
Yeah.
how to look at what I'm looking at.
I mean, I do think there's a lot of different methodologies that touch on this. There's the psychotherapeutic methodologies. There's some contemplative ones as well. Like things I've worked with and I know work well are things like core transformation, which I think you're familiar with.
Mhm.
Stephen Connery Andreas in the NLP tradition. Um, I've also found Dan Brown's ideal parent figure protocol to be helpful um, in terms of healing. And my friend Daniel Thorson is sort of taking that work and extending it to like attachment with reality itself. I think that's quite a helpful frame. Personally, I found entheogens and psychedelics to be helpful here. MDMA for me, when used as a tool for healing, was extremely helpful. It sort of felt like it helped bypass a lot of the heart blockages and just be able to access immediate unconditional love, which then could be applied to my personal, story and experiences. I understand I haven't worked with ayahuasca, but I understand that can be helpful for some people. I mean, there are lots of things that here that I think can be helpful. Um, I do think having a view that is not just individually focused. Like I recently did some work with an IFS person, and I wanted to work with this pain and trauma, etc. And this was an extremely skilled practitioner, so this definitely wasn't the practitioner at all. I couldn't have found a more skilled practitioner, but I found it wasn't really helping. Like it was like I was working with inside the frame of the self and working with all this stuff, and it wasn't unhelpful, but it didn't address the root causes. So I feel like, things like ancestral healing, the work that Thomas Hubel is doing, I think is really promising. He's exploring a lot of different ways of looking at collective healing, intergenerational healing. um I don't know, those are the kinds of things that I find particularly helpful, but I think that the view and the intention have almost as much power as the methods, although the methods will constrain what one can do, because they have their own sets of assumptions. Like IFS is pretty individualistic in its
Definitely.
orientation, and I think that's limiting here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a fan of the somatic
Mm.
practices too, the
Yeah.
ones that also look toward the body and being inhabiting different areas of the body where there's tension. Those seem to be able to get underneath at the root of some of these things because they are held in the body. And so if you can go in without even necessarily having stories about what's happening, that can be helpful. And I'll mention another one that's pretty unorthodox, which is I think hypnotherapy and past life regression therapy,
Mhm.
working with someone that's skilled, can actually be quite helpful here too.
Yeah.
Even if you hold it open as to whether or not the things that arise in doing so are actually real, if they help you make sense of yourself and your life better, and you feel more integrated and whole upon doing it, which has been my experience, then that can still be helpful, even if it's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And so in my practice, I like to use the phrase somatic-imaginal to refer to these umbrella of practices that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all of these practices are introducing different ways of engaging with the body and playing with the imagination to connect more
Right.
deeply with our experience. And yeah, IFS is like one beautiful school of thought that talks about how to play with imagination, but there's so much room for,
Mm.
yeah, creativity. And it's easy to dismiss stuff like past life regression. But even just seeing it as a metaphor opens up something like it. Also, what you said about the lens of interdependence, uh,
Right.
and allowing things to not make sense, to
Mm,
surprise you, to live out what's in your body but never was part of your explicit biographical history.
right. Right.
Yeah. And I want to come back to Palestine. Uh, what would you say to someone who feels like, yeah, it doesn't feel like a priority? That for them, however, whatever their makeup is, how they view life,
Yeah.
and even if they feels like, oh, what everything that you're saying makes sense, and it seems like if I allow myself to look at what's here, it will inevitably bring something up. It doesn't feel like a priority. And there's something about, and
Hmm. Hmm.
and partially that can be avoidance, like not making it a priority or not deeming it as important can be avoidance, and some of it can be wise in some ways where, and it's not um, the most easy way. There is no easy way to like have a clear answer of like what degree of priority or importance this should
Right.
take up in my worldview and things that I want to attend to. And so there's
Right.
some kind of ordering game here. Uh, and I'm
Hmm.
curious if you have anything to say. And also inviting you to, yeah, if there's anything that you want to like from your heart say to nudge someone to make this a priority, if you were to let yourself, yeah, fully go in that direction, yeah, inviting you to take up space and do that.
Yeah. I mean, I really, I really look at the priority question. It's like, how do we prioritize? Well, we prioritize based on value. So a list of priorities is a list of the things that we value the most.
Yeah.
And it's in a sense a hierarchy of value. So so I think one thing that's really interesting is like, just the question of how are you determining what it is that you do value, and how do you, have you actually put deep consideration into your values, and is it conscious, your prioritization, or is it based on some unconscious habitual inherited set of priorities? If you haven't done that work, I would, that's what I would encourage people to do first, is like just to make your values and priorities conscious,
Mm.
so that you can actually look at what's important to you, and not just theoretically, but also look at your behavior, look at what you spend your money on, look at what you use your other resources on, like your social capital and your time. What do you actually value based on that? Like, be real, take an inventory, look at what matters to you, and then you can start to have a kind of reckoning with your own values. I think that's one thing, and I think if people do that, um it's likely that if like everyone were to do that, it's likely that the situation in Palestine would get radically better. I'll just like use that as a first hypothesis, like
Mhm.
that if people were more conscious about what matters to them, and they're more honest with themselves about what actually matters to them, and they moved in a more conscious way toward reprioritizing, that would be better for people in Gaza, for instance, in the West Bank. Um, because I don't know how every person should prioritize their lives. I can't say that. I've had some disagreements even with other, Buddhist teachers who are into social activism, and I never thought I'd get into activism. Honestly, never. And I find myself to be like now a Palestinian activist, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's new. I found myself, having differences of opinions with people who are saying, for instance, like, well, why aren't we focusing as much energy on the Sudanese situation and the civil war and genocide that's occurring in Sudan? And to which I say, well, I'm not, because one, I'm fucking Palestinian. So like it has it that this is closer to home for me, and it matters more to me because I have literally have family in the West Bank right now and I want them to be safe. So that's part of it. And I acknowledge my ethnocentrism there. And I say, like, that's part of the deal. We care. And it's like the people asking these questions are often African. So like they obviously care that Sudan is not being mentioned as much.
Yeah.
And the second thing I say is it's pragmatic, it's practical. What things can we actually have some influence on? As an American, I actually have some influence on the situation in Palestine because the US has such a huge role to play and is playing in that situation. Like if the US stopped supporting Israel right now, probably, likely, this would stop, or it would change dramatically.
Yes.
Probably Palestine would become a recognized state. We'd stop vetoing the UN's proposals for Palestine to be a state, and then it would be a state. And that would change the entire geopolitical dynamic. So yeah, as an American, I feel like I have a little bit more. I have more leverage to influence, and I care more because of my background to do something there. And I think that matters. Like we look at the leverage that we have and the things that matter to us, and find those places where we have both leverage and it matters.
Yeah.
And then we can form networks of solidarity and mutual support. And like, yeah, it doesn't. The people in Gaza are not the only people who are suffering, and not the only people who matter. Of course, that's important to recognize, and we want this beautiful vision of like world or planet centric, you know, peace to arise. I think that's something we can all connect on and agree with, most of us. But practically speaking, how do we get there, and what do we each focus on with our limited time and resources? Yeah, that's a very personal question.
Yeah. 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 And I feel, given our web of interdependence, if each of us were to, yeah, like you said, just take a conscious inventory of what we value and then prioritize what truly matters to us and care for who we truly want to care to, and which could just be, for example, your parents.
Sure.
There's something about, yeah, some kind of image in my head where the web of interdependence will ensure that the care makes its way through indirectly in its own ways to even Gaza in some sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, another thought that came up for me was that, yeah, there's, maybe we get caught up in some kind of false dichotomies that I can either prioritize this or that, and
Right.
uh, or some kind of fear that if I were to prioritize this, it would threaten this other thing that I care about. And there's a lot of false assumptions in
Right.
that we could investigate. And yeah,
Mm.
it probably turns out that the state space of possible actions is very big, and that you can simultaneously care about a lot of things simultaneously without um, neglecting your own needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. I think that's certainly often the case, that we're able to um kind of see connections between things, or even ways of holding our values in a way that includes more complexity, includes more. I see that very much as like a good developmental capacity again. And then at times when we regressed, or we're just overwhelmed, or we're struggling, we have, we expand and contract in terms of our ability to do that.
Yeah.
And not everyone's maximal expansion point is the same, so I think that there is a reality to there being limitations at times, and we have to honor that. But it's, yeah, like you're saying, it's not always true that sometimes the limitations are from the past, or like we haven't updated our schema for what we're capable of. We might be capable of more than we think, but oftentimes people are capable of less than they think,
Mm.
and they actually need to pull back and stop trying to do everything because they're doing it really poorly. Like the angry activist comes to
Yeah.
mind, the person who's, and I've been in this boat for sure, where it's like, yeah, you're not really having the impact you want because you're so overwhelmed and so with the suffering of the world, and you're not taking care of yourself, and your basics of your life are not, stable. So that's coming out in your activist work, and it's filtering what you say through this sort of lens of resentment and isolation or whatever. You haven't healed some trauma and you're playing it out as an activist. These things I think are important too. So middle way, I don't know. It's the easy Buddhist response, just to punt to the middle way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. There's
Yeah.
it's good nuance.
And yeah, before we move towards closing, there's one last question that I want to ask. And so, yeah, okay, taking a step away from some of these abstractions and coming back to the concrete, I think one of the thing that a lot of people are implicitly or explicitly asking, what is the state space of possible actions that they could take
Mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm.
support the people in Palestine? And yeah, there are people that care, that feel heartbreak looking at what's happening, but then feel helpless that, oh, there's only so much that I can do, and I can only be a witness to what's happening in
Right.
silence.
Right. Yeah, no, I think this is important, and I've been learning a lot. Um, I've been learning a lot around this from my Palestinian cousins, who I'm close with and who I grew up with. Because I've had this assumption that, like, okay, the main lever I have is I'm an American, and America's role in this is so obvious that I can try to influence public opinion and reach out to my representatives and do this sort of conventional politics.
Yeah,
And I think there's something to be said for that. If you're an American, like, you do actually have a pretty big influence, relatively speaking, on this issue and this topic. And if enough Americans were uh, strongly committed to, um, activists in this domain, it would change. It is changing public opinion, and you can see this in Europe as well. The number of countries which have recently shifted toward saying they're going to recognize Palestine as a state. Like, why are they doing that? It's not because the politicians want to do that. It's because the people are demanding that. So, that matters. But I would say one thing that matters for all of us is, like I said earlier, is like understanding our own histories, and getting curious about where we come from and the historical kind of conditioning that's led up to us. Um, what can we do to help? We also don't have to just look at it in terms of politics. Like, what my cousin Deanna recently helped me see that, while I was chugging a big thing of Mexican Coke, she pointed out that Coca-Cola is one of these companies that's been sort of enabling the situation in the West Bank by having a factory there that's an Israeli-run factory in an international, in its zone internationally, where they shouldn't be operating. And likewise Pepsi. Like, there's a number of companies who are sort of directly profiting off of the sort of apartheid state and genocide. There's a whole economics of genocide there.
yeah,
And that I can actually not spend my money on or toward these companies. So classic corporate boycotts are also a possible way to have even a small amount of influence. There's lots of directions. I think the thing I suggest to most people is, especially when they don't know the history, is just like, learn about the history. Spend some time on ChatGPT and, like, try to understand the situation, and even straw man it toward Israel, and sort of like try your best to get the narrative that says that Israelis are the total victims here, and like, good luck. If you do that, you're going to learn something that you probably didn't know. And I've had friends that have done that, and it's totally changed their view on what's happening to reckon with the history, the objective history, and to see different perspectives on that, not just one echo chamber, but like really go and try to understand what happened there. Um, those just changing your view changes your actions, changes how you think about things. So there's lots of little things people can do without having to become a full-throated, Palestinian activist like I am, and that can help. So it's like those are the things I think of the most these days.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah, and any closing remarks or reflections, anything that you want to say from your heart?
Hmm. Earlier you're talking about the role of the internet in all of this and how in a way it feels like it's happening so far away.
Yeah,
um and I think that's true, and then there are also all these fragmented different perspectives, and it's hard to know what's right in terms of like even relatively speaking, like
yes,
confidence levels,
yes,
even if you're not holding it as absolutistic. That said, I think the beauty of the internet right now, is that we're much more connected to what's happening now in Gaza than we were, say, in Europe in the 1930s and 40s during the Jewish Holocaust. Like we, very few Americans, for instance, heard anything directly unless they had Jewish family members who were directly impacted by this. It was all like kind of murmurs and rumors. There wasn't much
yeah,
being printed about this in our press. And so, like, we actually are much more informed and can be much more informed about what's happening now. It's like the good news, bad news of being, having access to all this information is like we do have a better picture of what's happening if we're willing to look. And if you like, I'm looking every day at the situation. It's like, whoa, it is too much sometimes. But no one has an excuse for not knowing except that they don't want to know. That's it. You can know. You just have to look.
just have to look.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, Vince. And yeah, my
Yeah,
heart
my pleasure.
goes out to you and all the people in Palestine. And
Yeah.
I hope, yeah, we can collectively, yeah, bring a resolution to this sooner rather than.
Yeah. I think we will. I mean, it's just a question of uh, what it's going to look like. This feels very similar. If history repeats itself, right? This feels similar to the World War II, and that like there's some kind of cycle that's repeating itself. And maybe it's a natural cycle, like the cycles of insight, in meditation, where what is it that we learn in the dark night of the soul, collectively, in the collective dark night of the soul, when we can watch people being mass murdered and not be taking collective action to stop it for years on end. Like, what is there to learn from that? And how would that transform humanity to be able to look at it?
Yeah,
It could be quite powerful.
yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Theo.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, you too.